Tonight we wander into a soggy Viking field, where mud clings to your boots, your cabbages look half dead, and somehow this is still considered farming. The rain is not so much falling as it is politely sitting on everything. It clings to the roof of your turf house, it soaks into your wool tunic, it even sneaks into your porridge before you can finish your bowl. Welcome to Viking farming. You probably won't make it through this day, but that's fine. Nobody ever expected you to. You step outside into the gray half-light, and the world smells of wet earth, damp sheep, and a faint trace of smoke curling from the neighbor's chimney hole. Somewhere, a cow moans in complaint, as if to remind you that you are responsible for its continued survival, even though you can barely keep yourself dry. Before we go further, take a deep breath, let your shoulders sink, and remember, you don't actually have to hoe turnips in the rain. You just have to listen and maybe fall asleep halfway through the story. And if you enjoy this meandering drizzle of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is there. You'll be amazed at how many other sleepless farmers are scattered across the world. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. The year is somewhere between the 9th and 11th centuries, give or take. Your little farmstead is a few planks of wood, a roof of turf, and a lot of wishful thinking. Viking society, contrary to all the horned helmet drama, was made mostly of farmers. Real raiding was more of a seasonal side hustle, something to do when the cabbages refused to grow, which was often. The big historical fact to remember here: about 90% of Norse people were farmers, and most never set foot on a longship headed for glory. They were too busy trying to convince soggy barley to stay upright. A hen clucks past your feet, staring at you with the suspicion only chickens can manage. It wants grain, but the grain you've stored is already turning musty. You mutter to yourself, wondering if raiding might not be easier than farming after all. Scholars still debate whether farming was truly sustainable in every Norse settlement, or if desperation often nudged people toward more dramatic professions, like stealing monks. You head toward your field, where the soil is heavy with clay. It clings to your wooden plow, making each step feel like you're dragging half the earth behind you. Your neighbor waves from across the fence line. He's holding a cabbage the size of a fist, triumphant as though he has grown treasure. This is the Viking version of winning the lottery: one slightly edible cabbage. Obscure tidbit for you: Vikings used dried fish bones in their fields as a kind of fertilizer. You may find yourself tucking fish heads into the soil, hoping that somehow this counts as innovation rather than desperation. You tell yourself it's science. The clouds hang low, your boots squelch deeper, and for a moment you think about abandoning all this to become a poet, or a trader, or maybe just a man who naps a lot. But the sheep bleat from the pen, reminding you that even failure takes effort here. Farming, you discover, is less about success and more about keeping things barely alive. And so the day begins. Soggy, slow, and faintly absurd. You are still in the field, though at this point field is generous. It is more like a damp clearing in which plants reluctantly exist. You lean on the plow and watch your ox stare back at you, chewing grass as if mocking the entire concept of human effort. If this is agriculture, you think it's more mud therapy than food production. The sun is a pale disk trying its best to warm the earth but failing miserably. You trudge along the furrows, thinking about bread. Bread would be nice. Bread is always the goal. But bread requires grain, and grain requires dry storage, and your roof leaks. There is a soggy loop to all of this. Here's a major fact to keep you awake just a little longer. Barley was the most important Viking crop, not because it tasted wonderful, but because it made beer. And beer, unlike water, was less likely to kill you. You might not always have bread, but you could usually have a drink. So yes, the Viking diet was partly an accident of public health. You glance at your wife, who is busy spreading wet clothes on a line that will never dry. She hums under her breath, something between a lullaby and a complaint. Later she will churn butter, mend sails, and remind you gently that if you die in the field, she'll need to remarry quickly because someone has to keep feeding the sheep. And here's your obscure tidbit. Viking farmers sometimes grew onions not only to eat, but to test wounds. Yes, onions. If a warrior was stabbed, someone might feed him onion broth. If the smell of onion came out of the wound, it meant the guts had been pierced. Science, Viking style. You walk back toward the house, boots heavy with mud, and pass the same hen again. This time she is perched on the roof, somehow looking more successful at life than you. You wonder what career advice a chicken might give. Probably something about scratching dirt and lowering expectations. Historians still debate whether Viking farmers were truly self-sufficient or whether survival relied heavily on trade. Did you actually grow enough? Or did you just swap whatever pitiful crops you had for fish, furs, or gossip from the next farmstead over? The answer is lost in the mist, like most of your harvest. By evening, you find yourself back inside the turf house. The fire smokes, the children squabble, and the roof drips politely into a bucket. You tear a piece of dried fish and chew slowly, pretending it's a feast. Someone tells a story about a distant relative who went on a raid and came back with silver. You think about silver, but mostly you think about cabbages. The day ends much as it began. Damp, slow, and faintly absurd. And you, the terrible Viking farmer, have survived one more round of mud, sheep, and disappointment. Morning arrives again, if you can call it that. The light is more of a gray smudge on the horizon, seeping into the clouds like watered-down paint. You crawl from your turf house, blinking at the mist, wondering if time is passing or just looping. The rooster crows, not triumphantly, but like someone reluctantly clearing his throat. You tug on your boots, which are still wet from yesterday. They squish against your feet in a way that feels less like footwear and more like punishment. Outside, the air smells of damp wool, smoke, and something suspiciously like turnips that gave up last season. You sigh, and somewhere in the distance, a raven caws, probably laughing at you. You step into your farm, which once again looks like a mud festival sponsored by rain clouds. The ox refuses to move until bribed with hay, which is itself damp. You mutter something about heroic sagas and how none of them mentioned the joys of plowing clay. A saga about farming would not have made it past the first stanza. Lo, he went into the mud, and the mud was displeased. Not exactly inspiring. Here's a fact to plant in your mind. Viking farms were organized around small family units, each with their own patch of land and livestock. The longhouses weren't just homes. They were barns, kitchens, workshops, and storage sheds all rolled into one slightly smoky package. You live, eat, and sleep with your animals close by, which sounds charming until you realize cows snore. Your wife calls out that the sheep have escaped again. You look over and yes, there they are, standing triumphantly on a small mound, staring at you as if they've declared independence. You grab a stick and shuffle toward them. By the time you herd them back, you are wetter, muddier, and vaguely resentful of wool in general. Odd tidbit for you. Viking farmers used horse manure as insulation in their turf houses. You're not sure whether to feel impressed or disheartened by this knowledge. But either way, your walls are literally warmer thanks to yesterday's horse. Back at the field, the ox finally lumbers forward, dragging the plow through the sticky earth. You think about all the things you'd rather be doing. Singing, trading, sleeping, even raiding sounds like a vacation compared to this. But someone has to keep the barley alive, otherwise there's no beer, and without beer, Viking life gets significantly less cheerful. Historians still debate whether early Norse farmers were skilled at crop rotation or whether they simply guessed and hoped for the best. Judging by your current mud-smeared existence, You'd put money on hoping for the best. By mid-afternoon, your cloak is soaked, your hands are numb, and your ox has decided he's done working for the day. You can't even argue. He looks at you with that big bovine face that says, "We're all suffering human." So you pack up and trudge home, past the same suspicious hen who seems to be following your failures with interest. Inside, the fire smolders, filling the air with a haze that makes your eyes water. You sit, peel off wet boots, and think, another day, another round of barely keeping plants alive. Somewhere, someone is composing a saga about kings and warriors. Nobody will ever write the saga of you versus the mud. But here you are, stubbornly existing anyway. The next morning greets you with, no surprise here, rain. It patters gently on the roof of turf and manure, reminding you that weather doesn't care about your schedule. You roll over on your straw bed and think about pretending you didn't hear it. But the sheep bleat, the cow moos, and your wife stirs with the unmistakable sigh of someone who knows the laundry is about to get wetter. You shuffle outside, wrapped in a cloak that smells like damp wool and regret. The air is crisp, and the fields stretch out in a patchwork of brown and green. They look hopeful from a distance, like a painting. Up close, they look like disappointment. Today, you decide you will try something radical, drainage ditches. Because if the Vikings were anything, they were at least clever enough to move water around. You grab a spade and start digging, the mud clinging to your hands like it has sworn an oath to never let go. Every shovelful feels like an insult. By the time you've carved a small channel, water trickles in mockingly, as if to say, "Nice try, farmer." Here's a fact to keep your mind occupied. Viking farms often relied on communal grazing fields. Families would band together to let animals wander in shared pastures, which sometimes led to arguments about who owned which sheep. You look at your neighbor's sheep over the fence and wonder if they're secretly plotting to defect to your side. Midday arrives, and with it, hunger. You chew on a piece of flatbread so hard it could double as a roof tile. It is, in a way, comforting, like eating history itself, though with less flavor. You think wistfully of honey, but honey is for richer folk. For now, it's bread, dried fish, and the occasional turnip if the gods are kind. Your obscure tidbit for the day. Vikings sometimes buried butter in bogs as a way of preserving it. Yes, bog butter. You picture yourself stumbling across a lump of it centuries later and wonder if anyone would be brave enough to eat it. Spoiler: some people have tried. As evening settles, you watch your children chase each other around the smoky longhouse, their laughter rising above the crackle of the fire. For a moment, you feel almost rich. Not in silver, not in grain, but in the small, warm sound of family surviving another damp day. Historians still debate whether Viking farms consistently produced surplus food, or if famine was always looming just out of sight. You look at your modest pile of barley and think the debate is probably leaning toward famine. Outside, the rain eases, and the sky blushes with a faint streak of sunset. You take a deep breath, listening to the ox snore and the chickens rustle in their coop. It's not heroic, it's not glamorous, but it's life. And somehow it's enough. You wake to the sound of dripping. Not gentle dripping like a lullaby from nature. No, this is the determined drip of rainwater finding the exact weak point in your turf roof and landing squarely in the middle of your forehead. You sigh, sit up, and stare at the sagging ceiling like it's done this on purpose. Outside, the morning is a misty watercolor of gray and green, the kind of weather that makes you wonder if the sun has simply abandoned Scandinavia. You pull on your damp cloak again, because nothing here is ever dry, and shuffle out to face another day of not-so-heroic farming. The ground squelches beneath your boots like porridge that gave up on being food. Your ox is chewing thoughtfully, staring at you as if to say, "Really? Again?" You pat his flank half-heartedly and mutter something about shared suffering. Together, you drag the plow back into the field. The earth resists as usual, but at least you've learned to expect that. It's less plowing and more a conversation with mud, one in which mud always has the final word. Here's your daily grounding fact. Vikings cultivated barley, rye, and oats as their staple crops. Barley, especially, was the backbone of the diet, not just for bread but for beer. You remind yourself of this as the plow sticks again. Without this muddy labor, there is no beer. And beer, frankly, is the only reason to tolerate days like this. Around midday, your wife emerges carrying a basket of wool. She sits on a rock and begins spinning yarn, her hands moving in practiced rhythm, as though they belong to someone who actually enjoys being useful. She looks at you struggling with the ox and raises one eyebrow. You glare back, though secretly you admire her ability to turn sheep fluff into something warm and tangible. Obscure tidbit of the day. Vikings sometimes dyed wool with lichen, producing shades of yellow and green. You picture yourself in a lichen-colored tunic and decide you would look exactly as muddy as you already are. Still, it's nice to think of fashion in a world where socks are luxuries. Afternoon brings a rare visitor. Your neighbor trudges across the field, his cloak dripping rain like a portable waterfall. He grumbles about his chickens refusing to lay eggs and asks if your sheep are behaving. You laugh bitterly because of course they're not. For a brief moment, you share the warm bond of two farmers united by misery. Historians still debate whether Viking farmers had surplus enough to trade often, or if most of the time they were just scraping by. You look at your muddy hands and suspect the answer leans toward scraping. By evening, you are exhausted. You collapse onto a bench in the longhouse, watching smoke curl lazily up toward the rafters. The children are already asleep, curled together like puppies under a blanket of wool. You listen to the rain on the roof, the ox's heavy breathing, the faint crackle of the fire. Another day gone. Nothing legendary, nothing glorious, just mud, sheep, and the faint hope that tomorrow the sun might remember to show up. Morning greets you with silence. Not the golden silence of peace, but the suspicious kind, like the animals are plotting something. You sit up quickly, scanning the longhouse. The sheep are in the corner, chewing innocently. The chickens are in their coop, pretending to sleep. The cow is staring at you. Too much silence. Too much plotting. You step outside, suspicious, only to find the sky pretending to be blue for once. The fields glisten with dew, and for a moment, you almost believe the day might be good. Almost. Then you notice the fence. Or rather, the part of the fence that used to be there but is now broken, and the hoofprints leading toward the woods. Your sheep have escaped again. Of course they have. You follow the tracks, muttering to yourself. The forest smells of pine, moss, and faintly of your own frustration. You eventually find them near a stream, grazing smugly as if this was their idea all along. You wave your arms, shout, and manage to herd them back toward the farm. They resist every step because sheep don't believe in cooperation. By the time you get them home, you're sweaty, scratched, and certain you've lost a piece of your soul. Here's your history nugget for today. Viking farmers relied heavily on sheep not just for wool but also for milk and meat. Sheep were considered valuable enough to be mentioned in wills and sagas. You look at yours and think, valuable, yes, but also extremely annoying. Your wife shakes her head as you repair the fence. She reminds you that last week, someone's goat climbed onto the roof of their house and refused to come down. Livestock misbehavior, it seems, is universal. Obscure tidbit. Vikings occasionally made cheese out of sheep's milk, stored in small wooden containers. You wonder if anyone ever made escape sheep cheese as a sort of culinary revenge. By afternoon, the weather changes, as it always does. A sudden gust of wind sweeps across the field, sending a chill through your damp cloak. Clouds pile in like unwanted guests, and soon rain begins again. You trudge to the barn, check the hay, and discover it is damp too. Of course it is. Hay is never dry here. Historians still debate how effective Viking farmers were at preserving hay for winter. Some argue they were skilled at drying and storing it under turf. Others suggest they simply hoped for a mild winter. Judging by your damp pile, hope seems to have been the main strategy. As night falls, you sit by the hearth, the fire warming your face while the rain taps on the walls. The longhouse smells of smoke, stew, and damp wool. You cradle a wooden cup of thin ale, sighing at the thought of barley slowly rotting in the fields. You glance at the sheep, who look smug even in sleep, and mutter, "One day I'll win," but deep down you know you won't. The mud always wins. The morning is gray again, no surprise there. You pull yourself out of bed with the enthusiasm of a sack of turnips and shuffle to the doorway. Outside, mist rolls over the fields like a giant damp blanket someone forgot to air out. The ox is already awake, chewing with the slow, philosophical expression of a creature who has accepted life's pointlessness. You envy him. Today's problem is not the rain, not the sheep, not even the broken fence. No, today's problem is rocks. Your field, as it turns out, grows stones more reliably than barley. Every spring you clear them. Every spring they return. It's as if the earth itself enjoys a private joke at your expense, slowly pushing new rocks upward just to watch you trip over them. So, you spend your morning hauling stones into piles along the edge of the field. The ox helps a little, though mostly by looking dignified while you sweat. Your back aches, your hands blister, and the pile grows until it resembles the beginnings of an ambitious but pointless wall. You sigh and toss another rock. Here's a grounded fact. Viking farmers really did spend much of their time clearing stones from their fields. In parts of Scandinavia, you can still see long, low walls of piled rocks running through the countryside, ancient monuments not to kings or warriors, but to the eternal war between farmers and geology. Around midday, you spot your neighbor trudging over again. He eyes your rock pile, then shrugs. "Good stones," he says. "Might build something with them." You laugh, but not kindly. Build what? A castle? A palace for sheep? Rocks are just eternal chores in solid form. Obscure tidbit for the day. Some Viking graves were ringed with stones shaped like ships, a symbolic nod to journeys beyond death. You imagine your own grave surrounded by piles of useless field stones, the inscription reading, "He fought the rocks, and the rocks won." Afternoon comes, and so does the rain. You knew it would. It starts as drizzle, then thickens into something more personal, soaking your tunic until it sticks to your skin like cold porridge. You drag yourself back inside, collapsing by the fire. The stones outside sit smugly in the rain, knowing they'll be waiting for you tomorrow. Historians still debate how much of a Viking farmer's year was consumed by this kind of maintenance work. Stone clearing, fence mending, endless repairs. The sagas, of course, don't dwell on it. They prefer swords and dragons. But here, in your muddy little world, the real saga is about rocks. As you fall asleep that night, you dream of being a warrior. Not the sword-swinging kind, but a warrior armed with a giant shovel, battling boulders that sprout legs and chase you across the field. You wake sweating, then laugh to yourself. At least in dreams, you almost win. The rooster crows at dawn, or at least it tries. It sounds more like someone stepped on a bagpipe. You roll over, groaning, but eventually rise. Today, you've decided, will be different. Productive. Glorious. Today, you will finally fix the roof. The turf roof has been leaking for weeks, dripping steadily onto your bed, your table, and once directly into your stew. You gather tools. An axe, a spade, and what remains of your optimism. Climbing up, you realize the roof is less a roof and more a collection of soggy moss, twigs, and soil pretending to stay in one piece. It greets you with a wet squish underfoot. As you begin patching holes with new turf, the ox wanders over to watch. He stares up at you with his patient expression, chewing thoughtfully as if reviewing your work. You mutter, "Don't judge me," but you keep working anyway. Slowly, the roof becomes marginally less leaky. Marginally. Here's your historical fact for the day. Viking longhouses were often roofed with turf laid over wooden beams, insulated with layers of birch bark. They were sturdy, yes, but prone to sagging under rain and snow. Keeping them intact was a constant task, something rarely mentioned in the sagas. By midday, your wife joins you, handing up patches of moss like a reluctant assistant. She points out the gaps you've missed with the accuracy of someone who takes no joy in damp stew. You sigh and fix them one by one. Teamwork, Viking style. Obscure tidbit. Some scholars suggest that turf roofs encouraged herbs and wildflowers to grow, creating miniature meadows above Viking houses. You imagine sheep climbing up to graze on your roof and shudder. They would, wouldn't they? Afternoon brings a surprise. The weather clears. The sky, a pale northern blue, peeks out between the clouds. For once, the air feels almost pleasant. You take a moment, standing on the roof, to breathe it in. From up here, you see your farm stretched out below, muddy, stubborn, imperfect, but yours. Historians still debate how long these turf houses lasted before needing complete rebuilding. Some say 20 years, others less. Judging by your roof, you suspect it's closer to until the next heavy rain. By evening, the fire is warm, the roof drip has stopped, for now, and the stew tastes less like disappointment. You sit by the hearth, listening to the quiet, the ox's low sighs, and the faint rustle of wind outside. You think maybe farming isn't glorious, maybe it isn't legendary, but on rare days like this, it's survivable. And in the Viking world, sometimes survival is the closest thing to victory. The morning greets you with another symphony of dampness. You wake not to sunshine, but to the steady plop of water dripping from somewhere unseen, though not from the roof, thankfully, because you've already fought that battle. This time it's the drinking barrel. The wooden staves have swollen unevenly, and water has begun to trickle down onto the floor. You drag yourself over, muttering words that aren't in the sagas. The ox, as always, looks on, chewing with the slow confidence of a creature whose only responsibilities are grass and digestion. You envy him more every day. You fetch your tools. With wooden wedges and a hammer, you try to tighten the barrel's iron hoops. The work is tedious. The hammering echoes through the house, and your wife looks up from spinning wool with an expression that says, "Again!" She's right. This isn't the first barrel you've fixed this month. Here's your major historical fact. Viking households relied heavily on wooden barrels not just for water, but for storing ale, fish, butter, and grains. They were everyday lifelines. A leaky barrel was not an inconvenience, it was a threat to survival. As you hammer, you remember your neighbor bragging last week about his fine, imported barrel from Dublin, bound in shining hoops. You roll your eyes. Let him brag. You'll keep patching yours until it finally gives up. Obscure tidbit. Some barrels were so large they could be repurposed as bathtubs or, more grimly, coffins. You glance at your barrel, dripping defiantly, and think, perhaps it's auditioning for both roles at once. By afternoon, the leak slows. Success of a kind. You refill it with water from the stream, balancing 2 heavy buckets across your shoulders. Each step splashes your legs, soaking your trousers. The stream is cold, clear, and a little too full of leeches for comfort. You sigh, staring at the current. One day, maybe there will be a world where water flows from walls endlessly without leeches. You laugh at yourself. Madness. Historians still debate how sophisticated Viking cooperage, barrel making, really was compared to continental Europe. Some say their barrels rivaled any in medieval Europe, Others think they were a little rough around the edges, like everything else about Viking farms. That evening, you finally sit by the hearth again, hands blistered, arms aching, but with a faint sense of achievement. The barrel holds, the floor is dry, and the stew tastes almost good. Small victories count. In the sagas, warriors win glory. In your saga, you win water. Morning comes not with rain, but with silence. A suspicious silence. You sit up, rub your eyes, and notice the ox is not where he should be. Neither is the goat. Panic flares. You rush outside, barefoot, mud squelching between your toes. The pasture gate hangs open. You groan. Of course it does. You should have fixed the latch last week. But there were roofs and barrels and rocks to worry about. Now your animals are missing. You track them across the soggy field, following hoofprints that wind toward the neighbor's meadow. Sure enough, there they are. The ox grazing happily, the goat perched smugly on your neighbor's half-fallen fence, chewing a thatch of his roof. Your neighbor himself appears, arms folded, eyebrows raised. Again, he says flatly. You stammer apologies, grab the goat by its horns, and lead the ox back home with a bundle of hay. The neighbor shakes his head, muttering something about how he should charge rent for your animals. You laugh weakly. He might not be joking. Here's your historical fact. Livestock was often the most valuable possession a Viking farmer had. Cattle provided milk, hides, and status. Sheep gave wool. Goats mostly gave trouble, as you now know personally. To lose an animal could mean disaster. Back at your farm, you tie the gate shut with rope. The goat eyes it critically, as if planning its next escape. You sigh. The animal is smarter than you'd like. Obscure tidbit. In some parts of Scandinavia, goats were believed to be sacred to Thor, pulling his chariot across the sky. You look at your goat, mud on its beard, mischief in its eyes, and think, no god would ride in this thing's company. By afternoon, the sun peeks out, drying the fields slightly. You take advantage of the moment to mend the pasture fence, driving wooden stakes into the mud. It's slow work, but with each post the field feels more secure. The ox watches you patiently, chewing. The goat, meanwhile, gnaws on your boot. Historians still debate whether Viking farms were primarily for self-sufficiency or trade. Some argue that surplus livestock and dairy fueled regional markets. Others think most farmers, like you, were too busy chasing goats to produce much extra. By evening, you collapse onto your bench, exhausted. The fire crackles, the goat finally settles, and the ox breathes heavily in the stable. You close your eyes. Tomorrow will bring new disasters, of course it will, but for tonight your animals are safe. That's enough. The morning begins with a sound you've come to dread almost as much as rain dripping through the roof. Silence in the chicken coop. Normally, it's a raucous clamor. Clucks, squawks, the occasional triumphant crow. Today, nothing. Your stomach sinks. You push open the creaky wooden door and peer inside. The chickens are huddled in a corner, staring accusingly at you as if this disaster is your fault. And it is. The fox has struck again. Feathers litter the floor, and the hole under the fence is glaringly obvious. You sigh so hard the chickens shuffle nervously, as if you're about to scold them for not guarding themselves. You kneel in the dirt, examining the gap. It's nothing fancy, just a loose patch where the mud softened after last week's rain. The fox didn't even need to try very hard. You patch it up with rocks and sticks, swearing under your breath. You remind yourself that Viking farmers prize chickens not only for eggs but for status. A farm with hens looked respectable. Losing one is embarrassing, like having your pants fall down in front of the neighbors. Historical fact: chickens were introduced to Scandinavia long before the Viking Age, but by the 9th century they had become common enough that nearly every farm had a small flock. They provided eggs, occasional meat, and, strangely enough, omens, since people sometimes read their behavior as signs from the gods. Obscure tidbit. In some sagas, roosters are described as cosmic alarm clocks. One in particular, Gullinkambie, the golden comb, was said to live in Valhalla, crowing at the dawn of Ragnarok. You look at your bedraggled, half-missing feather rooster and think, if this scrawny bird announces the apocalypse, no one will take it seriously. You spend the day gathering wood to reinforce the coop, hammering boards into place while the chickens watch, unhelpful but judgmental. The goat wanders over, chews on a plank, and wanders off again. The ox, as always, ignores the drama. Historians still debate how important poultry really was to the Viking diet compared to cattle, sheep, and pigs. Some suggest chickens were luxury animals in early periods. Others think they were so ordinary that no one bothered to record much about them. By dusk, the coop is patched, your hands blistered, and the chickens clucking nervously again, as if they sense the fox will return. You lean against the fence, exhausted, and mutter, "Try me tomorrow, fox." The fire crackles back inside, waiting for you, and the day ends, messily, but intact. The morning rain is gentle, almost polite, pattering against the turf roof like someone drumming their fingers on a table. You almost enjoy it until you remember what the rain means. Mud. Endless, bottomless mud. You step outside and sink instantly up to your ankles. The goat, perched smugly on a rock, looks delighted by your struggle. The ox trudges toward the fence, each hoof making a squelch loud enough to echo. Even the chickens are annoyed, hopping from one dry patch to another like they're avoiding stepping on hot coals. Mud isn't just an inconvenience. It seeps into everything: boots, walls, tools. Viking farms, historians remind us, were often surrounded by wetlands and marshes. Drainage was minimal. If you wanted to keep your house from sliding into the muck, you had to work constantly to redirect water with ditches and makeshift channels. You grab your spade and begin digging a small trench along the side of the house, directing runoff away from the door. It's heavy, sticky work. The mud clings to the spade like it doesn't want to let go, and every thrust makes you feel like you're trying to shovel porridge. Historical fact: turf houses, so common in Iceland and parts of Scandinavia, were effective at keeping warmth in, but they also soaked up water like sponges. Farmers had to repair and repack the turf walls regularly, or risk collapse. Obscure tidbit: some Icelandic farmers were known to spread seaweed across their fields as fertilizer, not just for crops but also to help firm up muddy soil. You stare at your trench and think, if only I had a beach handy. The rain continues all afternoon, filling your trench almost as fast as you dig it. You pause to catch your breath, leaning on the spade, and imagine a world where roads are paved and boots are waterproof. You laugh at the absurdity of such luxuries, then slip in the mud and land squarely on your backside. Historians still debate how much mud management really occupied Viking farmers. Some suggest it was seasonal after storms. Others argue it was a daily, grinding battle. Looking at your spade, your ditch, and your mud-streaked trousers, you lean toward the latter. That night, the fire glows warm inside. You sit with aching arms, steaming slightly from the dampness, while your wife shakes her head at your muddy clothes. You shrug. Farming isn't glory, it's survival, and survival tonight feels like keeping the mud on the outside of the walls instead of the inside. The day begins with an unusual calm. No rain, no foxes, no mysterious collapse of the cabbage patch. The air is crisp and clear, the kind of rare Viking morning that tempts you into thinking today might not be a disaster. You stretch, feel the stiffness in your shoulders, and step outside, only to discover the peace is deceptive. The pasture fence has collapsed. Not entirely, just enough that the goat has noticed. There she is, standing triumphantly on the top beam of what used to be a respectable boundary. The ox is already halfway through the gap, looking toward the neighbor's field as if contemplating a permanent relocation. You drop your bucket, mutter something unprintable, and get to work. Viking fences weren't decorative. They were survival. Without a sturdy barrier, animals wandered, crops vanished, and neighbors accused each other of theft. The law codes of the time are full of disputes about grazing rights, stray livestock, and broken boundaries. You, today, are living that legal headache. Historical fact: Viking farms relied on tuin, or enclosed fields, often surrounded by turf walls or wooden fences. These enclosures weren't just for animals. They protected precious hayfields, which meant survival in the long winters. You gather what would you have left: crooked branches, half-rotten planks, and begin mending the gap. The ox eyes you suspiciously, as if disappointed that his escape was foiled. The goat leaps down, bleats mockingly, and resumes chewing on something important. Obscure tidbit: in some sagas, fences are described as semi-sacred boundaries. Crossing them without permission could be seen as an insult, almost like trespassing into someone's hall. You look at your goat and wonder if she understands that she has committed a legally questionable act. Probably not. The work drags on through the afternoon. Every nail you hammer in feels like a battle against inevitability. The fence will break again. The goat will climb it again. The ox will plot escape again. And you'll still be here, patching, sweating, muttering. Historians still debate whether Viking fences were standardized or improvised, whether they were neat and orderly or a chaotic collection of whatever wood was lying around. Based on your own craftsmanship, you're leaning toward chaotic. By sundown, the fence is repaired, crooked, lopsided, but functional. You collapse onto a log, mud on your boots, splinters in your hands, and think, at least no one escaped today. Farming is just a series of patched fences and small victories against entropy. The sun rises, and with it, another sound that makes your heart sink: the buzzing of bees. Not a few bees, not a polite hum. An angry, insistent swarm circling the hives behind your house. Beekeeping, you remind yourself, is supposed to be rewarding. Honey is liquid gold, sweet and valuable in a world where sugar is unheard of. Beeswax makes candles, which means light in the long winters. In theory, you're blessed to have hives. In practice, you're terrified. You creep toward the wooden boxes, wrapped in smoke-stained cloth, holding a crude, smoldering torch. The bees aren't fooled. They buzz louder, darting past your face like tiny, winged warriors. One lands on your nose. You freeze. The goat, unhelpfully, bleats in laughter from a safe distance. Historical fact: Viking beekeeping was an important craft, with hives made from hollowed logs, woven skeps, or clay pots. Honey wasn't just food. It was essential for making mead, the drink of feasts and poetry. Without bees, no mead. Without mead, no joy. You gently lift the lid of one hive, praying the bees are too sleepy to care. They are not. They erupt in a furious cloud, and you drop the lid, stumble backward, and nearly trip into the ditch you dug last week for drainage. The ox watches blankly from the pasture, offering no sympathy. Obscure tidbit: in some folk traditions, bees had to be informed of household events, births, deaths, weddings, so they wouldn't abandon the farm. You imagine trudging out here, telling the bees your daily struggles, and wonder if they'd laugh as much as the goat does. Historians still debate how widespread beekeeping truly was in Scandinavia. Some argue honey was a rare luxury imported from abroad. Others that small farms kept enough bees for daily needs. You, standing here swatting wildly while bees aim for your ears, lean toward the daily side of the argument. By evening, your face is stung in 3 places, your pride is battered, but you have managed to extract a small pot of honey. You carry it inside like a trophy, set it on the table, and light a beeswax candle in triumph. The glow is warm, the honey sweet, and for a moment, all feels well, until a bee, somehow still inside your tunic, stings you on the back. You sigh, drink a spoonful of honey, and think, mead had better be worth this. The morning greets you not with sun or birdsong, but with mud. Mud everywhere. You step outside and sink ankle-deep before you even reach the woodpile. The sky is a low gray lid pressing down, and last night's rain has transformed every path, field, and ditch into a squelching bog. Your ox, of course, is standing serenely in the middle of it, chewing grass that somehow still exists. The goat, naturally, has found the one dry rock to perch on, smirking down at you as if she planned this entire situation. Mud, you think, is not just an inconvenience. It is the defining feature of Viking farming. Roads? Forget them. Drainage? A laughable concept. You slog forward, pulling your boots free with a sticky sound that could rival a drumbeat. Historical fact: archaeological digs in Viking-era settlements show layers of compacted mud and straw, evidence that entire streets were essentially managed swamps. People laid planks, brushwood, or straw down just to make paths walkable. Imagine your entire neighborhood being one long puddle you try to trick into behaving. You grab a bundle of straw and scatter it over the muck near the cowshed. It helps for about 3 seconds. Then the ox stomps through, grinding it into the mire, and you're back to square one. Obscure tidbit: some Viking households actually collected mud mixed with animal dung, dried it, and used it as fuel. Yes, fuel. Tonight's fire could be yesterday's puddle. You stare at the sludge beneath your boots and think, cooking dinner on this stuff might be the truest definition of flavor you can't wash away. Historians still debate whether Viking farmers saw mud as an unavoidable nuisance or simply part of the job. No saga ever begins with, lo, the hero fought bravely against the swamp in his backyard. But based on your daily struggles, maybe one should. By evening, you've laid down enough brush to keep the doorway clear. Your boots are caked, your back aches, and the goat has managed to stay spotless, her hooves perfectly dry. You mutter something about injustice, but then step inside, shake off the mud, and watch the fire catch. For all its misery, mud does make the home feel warmer when you finally escape it. The next day brings wind. Not a gentle breeze, not a refreshing gust, but the kind of howling gale that makes you question your roof's commitment to staying attached. You step outside and nearly lose your cloak as it whips sideways. The goat hunkers down by the wall, her ears flapping like little sails. Viking farms, after all, weren't known for shelter. Houses were sturdy but simple, long houses built of timber, turf, or stone, depending on what nature grudgingly allowed. They were designed to withstand winter, but wind? That was another matter. Historical fact: Viking longhouses often had turf roofs, thick and heavy, to keep heat in. But strong storms could peel back that turf, scattering it like a farmer's unwanted haircut. You glance nervously at the ridge beam of your house and hope today isn't the day it takes flight. You grab stones to weigh down loose sections, climbing awkwardly while the wind tries to shove you off like an impatient sibling. The ox bellows disapproval, and the goat bleats as though offering unsolicited commentary. Obscure tidbit: in some Norse traditions, people carved protective runes into the beams of their houses to guard against storms. You haven't done that yet, but as the wind rattles the shutters and whistles through cracks, you wonder if maybe your neighbor who scratched a rune into every doorway wasn't so superstitious after all. Historians still debate how much Viking farmers truly feared the elements versus simply endured them. Was every storm seen as the wrath of the gods, or just another Tuesday? Given your roof's current wobbling, you lean toward wrath. By evening, you've survived. The roof holds, the fire is still lit, and you even manage to repair the door that banged open so violently it nearly took out the chicken coop. You slump by the hearth, hair wild from the wind, cloak torn at one edge, and feel that particular kind of relief only farmers know. Nothing collapsed permanently today. You sip from a cup of thin ale, watch the goat curl up smugly in the corner, and think, being a Viking farmer is not a battle against enemies. It's a battle against weather that seems personally offended by your existence. The morning breaks with a sound you've come to dread almost as much as the rooster. Scratching. Not the gentle kind, like a chicken poking around for worms. No, this is the slow, deliberate, sinister sort of scratching that suggests something living exactly where it shouldn't be. You shuffle toward the granary, clutching a stick in one hand and half-awake irritation in the other. There it is, the enemy. Mice, possibly rats. A Viking farmer's nightmare wrapped in whiskers and teeth. You lift the lid of a grain bin and yes, there's movement. Little shapes dart away, tails vanishing like guilty shadows. Your winter food supply, which you thought secure, is already someone else's midnight feast. Historical fact. Viking farmers stored grain in pits or wooden bins, often sealed with turf or clay. Unfortunately, those designs were basically a buffet invitation for rodents. Archaeologists have found gnawed bones and rat droppings in storage sites, silent proof that medieval pest control was, well, not very controlling. You try plugging the gaps with clay and stones, muttering that you've become less of a farmer and more of a landlord evicting illegal tenants. The goat watches, unimpressed. The cat, supposedly your rodent specialist, stretches luxuriously by the fire and contributes nothing except a loud purr. Obscure tidbit. Some Norse folk believed rats could be driven away by reciting charms or hanging carved amulets near the grain bins. You imagine muttering poetry at the mice tonight and can't help but laugh, though honestly you'd try anything if it meant saving your oats. Historians still debate how effective Viking farmers were at preserving grain. Did most households limp through winter on dwindling supplies, or were they surprisingly clever at keeping pests out? Based on the tiny footprints in your flour sack, you suspect it leaned toward limping. By evening, you sit down with a bowl of porridge that tastes faintly of desperation and dirt. You're not sure whether the grit is from the clay seal or from what the mice left behind. You sigh. This, apparently, is the true flavor of authenticity. Tonight, you join the neighbors. Not for a feast, not for a grand festival, but for something far more practical. Mending fences. Literally, the sheep have discovered the art of escape. They wander into fields they shouldn't, nibble vegetables you swore were yours, and refuse to be rounded up unless half the village participates. You tramp out to the boundary posts with others, shoulders hunched against the wind, carrying whatever scraps of timber you can spare. Historical fact. Viking-era farms weren't isolated castles of independence. They were clustered communities, often sharing labor to maintain fences, ditches, and grazing rights. Cooperation wasn't optional, it was survival. You hammer stakes into the ground, lash brush between posts, and watch as the sheep, just beyond the new line, blink innocently, as if they hadn't spent the last 3 days plotting rebellion. Obscure tidbit. In Icelandic sagas, there are mentions of entire lawsuits over sheep trespassing. Yes, grown men went to court because one sheep wandered into the wrong meadow. You look at your woolly troublemakers and think, if medieval lawyers got paid in mutton, they must have thrived. Historians still debate just how formal these boundary systems were. Were Viking farmers meticulous about property lines? Or was it all just, don't let your goat eat my cabbages? The truth likely sat somewhere between stern rules and muttered threats across muddy fields. By the time dusk falls, the new fence stands, somewhat crooked but serviceable. Your cloak smells of wet wood. Your hands sting from splinters, and you're fairly sure one sheep smirked at you before wandering off. Back at the longhouse, you collapse by the fire. The goat curls smugly near your feet, blissfully unaware that she's next on the things to fence in list. You stare into the flames and realize Viking farming isn't about glory or gold. It's about losing small battles with animals, weather, and rodents and still showing up tomorrow. The first snow doesn't fall gently. It barges in like a drunk uncle at a wedding. Loud, messy, and impossible to ignore. You wake to a world blanketed in white, the fences you labored over nearly buried, and the sheep glaring at you as if the weather was entirely your fault. Winter in the Viking world isn't a surprise. You knew it was coming, but knowing and living are two different beasts. The longhouse creaks as the wind presses against its timber frame, the fire sputters, and you find yourself measuring the woodpile with the precision of a modern accountant balancing an empty bank account. Historical fact: Viking longhouses were designed with thick turf walls to trap heat, and smoke from the central fire seeped through the roof. It kept people alive, but also meant you spent most of winter smelling faintly like smoked herring. The daily routine becomes smaller now, focused inward. Feed the animals in their cramped stalls. Stir the stew that tastes of turnips and resignation. Patch holes in socks with wool that itches more than it insulates. You catch yourself wondering if boredom itself can freeze a person. Obscure tidbit: in some sagas, there are mentions of people playing board games like Nefadafel during long winters, moving little carved warriors across wooden grids. You picture your neighbors squinting by lamplight, arguing over rules that no one fully remembers, and you smile. It's the Viking version of arguing over Monopoly. Historians still debate how much leisure Viking farmers actually had during winter. Were they busy with crafts, storytelling, and weaving, or were they too exhausted to do more than sleep by the fire? You lean toward the second option after another day of hauling water through snow that somehow manages to go both down your boots and up your sleeves. At night, the blizzard rattles the shutters. You curl beneath furs, listening to the low breathing of family and livestock alike, all huddled together. Feels less like farming now and more like waiting out the universe. And the universe, annoyingly, is very patient. Days blend into nights. The horizon shrinks. Winter presses down with the weight of an uninvited houseguest who refuses to leave. You venture outside at dawn, boots crunching in the frost, to check the traps you set by the woods. Small game might stretch your dwindling supplies. Instead, you find one unfortunate rabbit and, somehow, a very smug-looking raven perched on your fence, watching as if to remind you that Odin's birds always get first pick. Historical fact: Viking farmers supplemented their diets with hunting and fishing, especially in lean winters. While farming provided the backbone of survival, the natural world had to fill in the gaps. No matter how carefully you planned, winter was always hungrier than you were. Back inside, the stew pot bubbles with yet another variation on root vegetables and hope. You chew slowly, convincing yourself this turnip tastes a little different from yesterday's. It doesn't. Obscure tidbit: some Viking households brewed a weak, low-alcohol beer throughout the winter, safer than water and mildly numbing to the monotony. You imagine raising a wooden cup to your fellow farmers and muttering, "To cabbage stew number 47," before collapsing into laughter that's mostly hysteria. Historians still debate just how grim these winters were. Were Viking farmers constantly teetering on the edge of famine, or did strong trade networks cushion the blow? The archaeological record offers hints in both directions. All you know is that your pantry shelf looks alarmingly bare, and it's only midwinter. You sit by the fire as the wind moans outside, shadows flickering against the turf walls. The goat shifts in her stall, the sheep sigh, and someone coughs softly in the dark. It's not heroic, this life. It's not raiding across seas or discovering new lands. It's turnips, snow, fences, rats, and the endless rhythm of feeding, mending, waiting. and yet somehow you endure. Tomorrow you'll wake up, trudge through snow, and do it all again. Because farming isn't about glory, it's about persistence and the stubborn hope that spring will come. The thaw doesn't announce itself with trumpets or harps. It arrives with slush. You step outside one morning and hear the first reluctant drip of meltwater plinking from the eaves. The snow is still thick, but it has lost its brittle edge, sagging into heaps that collapse underfoot like poorly baked bread. Spring is a relief and a nuisance in equal measure. The fields emerge in streaks of mud. The fences tilt drunkenly where frost pushed them up, and every animal you own suddenly smells as though it hasn't bathed since last harvest. Which, to be fair, it hasn't. Historical fact: Viking farmers used the thaw as a time to prepare their fields for planting, spreading manure as fertilizer and plowing with simple wooden or iron tools. It wasn't glamorous, but it was urgent. The narrow northern growing season left no room for hesitation. You squelch through the muck, shoes sticking and pulling like they'd rather stay buried. Each step is an exercise in patience. A neighbor waves from a distance, equally mud-smeared, and you both share the unspoken truth. This isn't farming yet. This is just enduring the in-between season. Obscure tidbit: archaeological finds suggest Viking farmers sometimes tuck charms or small carved figures into their fields during planting, hoping for better harvests. You consider carving a tiny turnip god and setting it in the soil, though knowing your luck it would just attract crows. Historians still debate whether Viking farmers deliberately rotated crops or simply planted the same spots until the soil gave out. Evidence is patchy, like the snow melting across the fields, leaving a landscape both revealed and uncertain. You scrape mud from your boots with a stick, sighing. Spring is here, technically, but instead of flowers and sunshine, you get mud, smells, and the nagging sense that the real work is about to bury you deeper than any snowdrift ever could. The first plow bites into the soil with a reluctant crunch. You guide the ox forward, its hide steaming in the weak sun, while clods of earth turn over like sluggish waves. It's satisfying, in a way, watching the land open up after months of white silence. But the work is punishing. Your shoulders ache, your boots sink, and every step feels like dragging yourself through history's least glamorous marathon. Historical fact: Viking plows were often simple wooden frames tipped with iron, pulled by oxen. They cut shallow furrows but were surprisingly effective, especially when farmers worked together in teams, sharing tools and labor. Farming was never truly solitary, it was communal survival. The air smells of damp earth and manure, a fragrance you tell yourself is wholesome, but which your nose insists is something else entirely. You glance at the fields stretching ahead, trying not to calculate how many hours of plowing still remain. It's like staring at a to-do list that keeps growing every time you blink. Obscure tidbit: in some regions, Viking farmers sowed beans alongside grains, partly because beans enriched the soil and partly because they made stew slightly less depressing. You imagine a weary farmer raising a single bean like it's a trophy, whispering, "Variety," before tossing it into the pot. Historians still debate the balance between livestock and crops in Viking farming. Were herds the mainstay with grain as a supplement, or was it the other way around? The truth probably shifted depending on where you lived, but from where you stand, both seem like backbreaking choices. By evening, your muscles hum with fatigue. You sit on a fence post, watching the sun dip, the field behind you neatly scarred in rows. The ox snorts, unimpressed by your efforts, and a raven caws from a branch, reminding you that all this toil might come to nothing if the weather turns sour again. Still, there's a faint satisfaction in the dirt under your nails. Spring is mud and sweat, yes, but it's also hope, tilled directly into the earth. You wake one morning to find the fields sprouting tiny green threads, fragile as whispers. They push through the soil, trembling in the breeze, and for the first time in months you see a color that isn't white, brown, or gray. Green. It's almost enough to make you forget the backaches, the mud, the endless smell of ox. Almost. The seedlings lean in rows like sleepy soldiers who haven't yet realized they've been enlisted. You crouch down, brushing your fingers over the leaves, marveling at how much of your future is staked on something so frail. A single hailstorm, a week without rain, a flock of hungry birds. Any of these could undo months of labor. Farming, you realize, is mostly bargaining with chance while pretending you're in control. Historical fact. Viking farmers grew barley, rye, and oats as staple crops. Barley in particular was essential, not only for bread but for ale, which was safer to drink than water in many places. You suddenly understand why beer was considered a daily necessity rather than a luxury. From the corner of your eye, you notice weeds already plotting their invasion. They creep along the furrows, opportunists taking advantage of your distracted admiration. You sigh, pulling a few by hand. For every weed you pluck, 5 more sprout, as though they've signed a collective bargaining agreement to outpace you. Obscure tidbit. Some Viking communities held small rituals to bless the fields, walking the boundaries with torches or singing chants. You imagine yourself humming a tune as you weed, not for the gods, but for morale, a lullaby for barley. Historians still debate how much ritual and magic Viking farmers mixed into their daily agriculture. Was it essential faith or just something to do while waiting for seeds to sprout? The evidence is scattered like seeds themselves, suggestive but never certain. By evening, you're tired from bending, plucking, and muttering. Yet as you glance over the field, the green is thicker, braver, and you allow yourself a tiny smile. Against all odds, the earth is cooperating for now. The weeds are winning. You swear they've grown faster overnight, bold and insolent, as though mocking your efforts. You walk the rows with a wooden hoe, scraping at them while mumbling threats. The barley shoots look fragile beside these intruders, like awkward teenagers trying to hold their place at a crowded dance. Historical fact. Weeding was one of the most time-consuming chores in Viking farming. Entire families took part, children included, because the alternative was watching crops choke before they could mature. There were no shortcuts, only hours of bent backs and dirty hands. You pause to straighten, your spine creaking like an old door. Overhead, a raven watches from the fence post, perhaps amused at your futility. You throw a clod of dirt in its direction. It doesn't even flinch because even birds know who's really in charge here. Obscure tidbit. In some folktales, weeds were said to sprout where trolls spat or where witches had walked. You briefly entertain the idea of blaming your weed problem on a roaming witch. At least then you'd have someone to curse besides yourself. Historians still debate whether Viking farmers attempted any form of fertilization beyond manure. Some argue they practiced slash-and-burn techniques to refresh fields, while others think that was too destructive in settled areas. Either way, it's clear that weeds never took a holiday. By midday, you're sweaty, sore, and questioning your career choices. Not that you had many. Viking life didn't exactly offer internships in other professions, unless you count raiding, which is just unpaid travel with souvenirs. Yet, when the sun dips lower, you notice the difference. The rows look cleaner, the barley stands taller, and for a fleeting moment you feel like maybe, just maybe, you're a competent farmer after all. Then you spot another weed sprouting defiantly between your boots, and you laugh, because the joke is on you. The summer wanes, as all summers must, fading not with a flourish but with a long sigh. The fields lie golden under the tilted sun, barley bending like tired shoulders. You walk between the rows, brushing your hand against the grain, each stalk whispering its own small secret. Soon you will cut them down, bind them, and stack them. But tonight, the fields still breathe, stretching toward the horizon in one last shimmer of life. Historical fact. Viking farmers harvested with simple sickles, bending low to slice and bundle by hand. It was tedious, exhausting work, but it provided the grain that became bread and ale, the true foundation of survival. Obscure tidbit. In some places, farmers left a few stalks standing as an offering to the land spirits, a gesture of thanks for a harvest granted. You pause by a corner of the field and wonder whether you should do the same. Not because you're superstitious, of course, but because gratitude in any age feels like good insurance. Historians still debate how communal Viking harvests were. Did entire villages gather together, or did each household manage its own? The evidence suggests both, depending on region and year. What is certain is that harvest marked not only an ending but also the quiet beginning of another cycle. You stack the bundles carefully, tying them with straw, and by the time the light fades the field looks different. Tidier, but also emptier, as though something vital has departed. You stand still, listening to the hush of the wind, and realize how farming is less about winning battles and more about enduring seasons. And now the story settles. The fields are harvested, the barns are full, and the tools lean silent in the shed. The long months of bending, digging, cursing the weeds, and muttering at the rain have drawn to their natural close. What was once fragile green shoots, then bold golden stalks, is now resting safely in storehouses, waiting for winter feasts and daily bread. You walk back toward the farmhouse, the path soft under your boots, the sky painted in fading streaks of rose and gray. Smoke curls lazily from the hearth inside, and the smell of something warm drifts out. Perhaps a stew, perhaps just barley boiled into something vaguely edible. The details don't matter much now. What matters is the warmth, the stillness, and the quiet knowledge that the work for this year is done. In the corner of the yard, a hen settles into her roost, feathers puffed like a pillow. The dog circles twice before sinking into straw. Even the raven that mocked your weeding has gone silent, tucked into its own shadow somewhere. The world, for once, is neither demanding nor noisy. The firelight flickers gently as you step inside, your muscles heavy, your eyelids heavier still. Tomorrow there will be chores, yes, there always are, but tonight you have the rare gift of stillness. You sit near the fire, listening to the crackle, and feel time itself slow down, stretching long and soft, like a lullaby. The Viking farmer in you, terrible though he may have been, has made it through another year. And in the calm of this moment, you sense the quiet rhythm of lives long past. Mud, cabbages, and rain woven into something strangely enduring. Close your eyes. Let the fields fade into mist. The story sleeps now, and so should you.